The recently released 2026 Global Air Power Rankings left a lot of people scratching their heads regarding exactly where India and China stand relative to each other. Look at the raw defense budgets, and the confusion makes sense. For 2026, China is spending roughly $275 billion, about 3 times as much as India's budget of $85 to $94 billion. This comparison table lays out the scale of that financial gap. China dominates the top-line US and fielding 3 aircraft carriers to India's 2. Looking at these figures, you'd be forgiven for assuming the outcome of a conflict is a foregone conclusion. If one side has 3 times the money and significantly more gear, the fight seems already over. But data often fails to account for the physical environment. When these paper statistics are forced into the extreme geography of the Himalayas, high-altitude physics begins to strip those numbers of their weight. The biggest mistake people make when comparing these two nations is imagining a border conflict where all 2 million-plus active soldiers on each side clash at once. This map illustrates China's strategic priority. The vast majority of their advanced resources are locked to their eastern seaboard, focused on Taiwan, Japan, and the US. This acts as a geographic filter. Near India, only a small fraction of China's military is realistically available. India's posture on the border is entirely different. Their troops are already forward deployed in the mountains, with a singular, unified objective: defending that specific boundary. Because Beijing cannot pull its forces away from the Pacific without leaving its flank exposed, it cannot bring its full army to bear against India. This effectively levels the localized troop numbers before a single shot is fired. If we count active personnel, reserves, and paramilitaries together, India actually fields a larger total force on paper, nearly 4.9 million personnel compared to China's 3.1 million. A huge chunk of India's number comes from its reserve pool. These are primarily highly trained veterans who retired after 15 to 17 years of service, holding a reserve liability to be called back by the government if needed. The catch with any reserve force is logistics. You can't just snap your fingers and deploy them. It takes weeks, sometimes months, to medically clear, re-equip, and physically transport these troops to the front lines. In a sudden, high-intensity border skirmish that might only last a few days or weeks, that activation delay means your reserves won't arrive in time to influence the outcome. In a realistic mountain conflict, the only personnel that actually matter are the active frontline units already positioned there. Massive reserve statistics are a theoretical advantage, not a practical one. Look at this landscape in Tibet. This is where China's western air bases sit, at altitudes climbing above 4,000 meters. Up here, military operations run into a hard wall of basic physics. At that elevation, the air is extremely thin. Thinner air directly reduces the amount of lift generated over the wings of an aircraft. This split screen shows exactly what that means for combat. A Chinese jet launching from 4,000 meters is physically forced to take off with only half of its maximum weapons payload and fuel. India's air bases serving the same border, like Tezpur or Chabua, are located down in the plains. Because they launch from low elevation, Indian jets operate at 100% of their payload and fuel capacity. China knows this, which is why they rely heavily on alternatives. This H-6 bomber, along with vast long-range rocket forces, allows them to fire cruise missiles from well outside India's air defense range to bypass the dogfighting limitations. Yet the fighter jet limitation cannot be engineered away. The extreme altitude acts as a great equalizer, leaving India with significantly more actual, usable combat air power in this specific theater, despite having fewer total jets nationwide. The altitude dictates the ground game as well. Chinese soldiers arriving from lowland areas require weeks to physically adapt to the thin air, facing high casualty rates from altitude sickness that actively degrade their combat performance. Now look at these soldiers navigating the steep, rocky paths of the Himalayas. India's specialized mountain units are permanently entrenched in the highest battlefields on Earth, making them biologically and tactically adapted to the terrain. Beyond the physical toll, there is a deep experience gap. Chinese President Xi Jinping frequently warns his military against peace disease, the vulnerability that comes from a military that hasn't fought a major war since 1979 against Vietnam. Contrast that with India. These Indian troops belong to a military that spends decades running continuous, real-world combat operations, low-intensity conflicts, and high-altitude counterinsurgency missions. The gene attempts to bridge this lack of human experience by leaning heavily into advanced drone technology and rigorous simulated training. Technology has its place, but in brutal, localized mountain warfare, human adaptation and deep combat experience give India an asymmetric edge that a simulator cannot replicate. By 2026, a specific shift occurred in how both nations handle their deterrence. Both sides moved nuclear warheads out of storage and into active, deployed conditions during peacetime. China is expanding its stockpile largely to counter the United States in the Pacific, but India's own active deployment firmly establishes a credible regional deterrent. This flowchart demonstrates what military planners call operating under a nuclear shadow. If a localized border skirmish begins, the overarching threat of mutual destruction forces both sides to intentionally block their escalation. That reality makes a full-scale conventional war highly improbable. In the Himalayas, the primary military objective is merely avoiding defeat and keeping the conflict from spiraling out of control. When you measure global power projection, like this massive armada cutting through the ocean, China remains the clearly superior force. But if the goal is strictly defending the Himalayan border, India has successfully neutralized that massive spreadsheet gap. A regional conflict up there is strictly governed by the immovable constraints of physics, extreme altitude, and logistics, not the size of a nation's defense budget. You have to look past the raw data. In our next video, we'll explore exactly how post-2020 technological adaptations are attempting to bend these geographic rules.